Greetings, everyone. Hope you are all having a delightful post-Thanksgiving Monday. I'm thrilled you are joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. This initiative is a collaboration between Notre Dame and Duke University. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns at Notre Dame. A quick note on logistics. As with everything Zoom, there are often technical challenges. Please note that there are several folks working behind the scenes that will quickly jump in and remedy things should anything emerge. Also note that after about 45 minutes, we will open it up for Q&A. Questions will be passed directly on to me, and I will ask them of our speaker. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Howard Gardner on what is good work. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Professor Gardner, he is the John H. and Elisabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is also an adjunct professor of psychology at Harvard University and senior director of the Harvard Project Zero. He is the author of 30 books translated into more than 32 languages. He is also author of several hundred articles. He is best known in educational circles for his theory of multiple intelligences, a critique of the notion that there exists but a single human intelligence that can be assessed by standard psychometric instruments. He's been honored with numerous awards and has achieved various honorary degrees from 31 colleges and universities around the world. Since the mid-90s, Gardner has directed the Good Project, a group of initiatives founded in collaboration with fellow scholars that promotes excellence, engagement, and ethics in education, preparing students to become good workers and good citizens who contribute to the overall well-being of society. Through research-based concepts, frameworks, and resources, the project seeks to help students reflect upon the ethical dilemmas that arise in everyday life and give them the tools to make thoughtful decisions. In early 2022, MIT Press will publish a new book by Gardner, written in collaboration with Wendy Fishman, The Real World of College. Welcome, Howard. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, Suzanne. I hope you can hear me all right. And
yes.
I appreciate the chance to be able to talk about this work, which has been important for me for many years. And I would like to hope that the toolkit that we've developed will be helpful to the people who are watching and listening.
Wonderful. So as we discussed, I'm hoping to do three things in this conversation. First, really get a sense of the Good Project and good work, where it came from, what the toolkit looks like, poke around a little bit there. Second, I'd like to more specifically consider perhaps what your work might offer folks in the professional education space. And then thirdly, to give you a chance to reflect on this crazy year and how it may have changed or perhaps amplified your thinking. Clearly, your work on good work engages and speaks to many of the radical shifts in the nature of work over the past year. So it seems a fruitful time to have that conversation. Seem reasonable?
Very good. I'm looking forward to hearing what you and I come up with.
Great. So first, what is the Good Project? Where did it come from? And how does it connect to good work in particular? This is now decades long. What was the origin?
Sure. 25 years ago, with two scholars, Bill Damon, whose work on the sense of purpose is probably well known to those who are attending today, and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who unfortunately died a few weeks ago, whose work on flow is very well known. The three of us had the chance to work at a center in California, and each of us had seen our work become well known, but also misused. in my particular case, there was a state in Australia where they listed all the different racial and ethnic groups and which intelligences they had and which ones they lacked. And I said, oh my God, this is nonsense, but the whole state has embraced it. What can I do? And because Mike and Bill had similar experiences, over the next few years, we developed something which we initially called the Good Work Project. We now call it for short, the Good Project. And the Good Work Project said, what does it mean to do good work at a time when everything is changing very quickly? And this was even before you had social media and other digital inventions. Nobody knew what Facebook was. Markets are very powerful, and we don't have counterforces to markets. So they're kind of going like a slalom very, very quickly. So what does it mean to do good work at a time like this? And what we did with many wonderful colleagues was to conduct about 1,500 interviews with people in 9 different professions: law, medicine, education, philanthropy, and so on. And we came up with what I now call a toolkit, a set of concepts which I think can help people think about what it means to do good work and also what it means to be a good person and a good citizen. And we'll be talking about this now, but for people who want to get a better edited version, we do have a website, thegoodproject.org, which documents all the things that we've written and done and all of the measures which we've developed.
Great. Can you describe a little bit the kind of core elements of the toolkit, or perhaps the 3 E's that seem central to your conceptual framework?
Let's make a distinction between the conceptual toolkit and the practical toolkit. We think of good work as having 3 elements. They all begin with the letter E: excellence, engagement, and ethics. Excellence means the worker knows what he or she is doing and does it well. That's not very controversial. Engagement means that the person cares. The person looks forward to going to work, enjoys colleagues, feels that he or she is doing something worthwhile. You can't make somebody engaged. That relates to Damon's sense of purpose. It's something you hope to nurture, and sometimes you can help, but I can't say, Suzanne, you have a new position, engage yourself. It's something that has to happen. The part that our group at Harvard has been particularly interested in is the ethical part, namely how, when you're faced with problems and dilemmas which arise all the time in any profession, how do you deal with them in ways which can pass the sniff test? Namely, the person has thought about it, consulted about it, tries to do the right thing. We don't always succeed. Then you learn from your mistakes and try to do better the next time. And I was just thinking today, because of course the coronavirus is on everybody's mind and the new Micron variables on their own mind. If you are a doctor, if you are a lawyer, if you are an educator, you need to be thinking about what's the right thing to do with this kind of uncertainty. And I jotted down some alphabets, which most of us didn't know: CDC, FDA, WHO, NIH. All of these institutions also have to decide how to do work that's ethical, what's the right thing to do. And the same thing with businesses, whether it's Moderna or Pfizer and so on. And we don't know the answers, but we have some ways of helping you think about it, and even to become aware that one has to wrestle with these issues and tries to do the right thing rather than sweep them under the rug or say that you're sure you know what the right thing is. And ethics is not about things we're sure of. It's ethics is what we're not sure of and trying to do the right thing. So that's kind of a quick, shall I say, gallop over 25 years. And if it wasn't clear, please push me.
So before we sort of push on this a little bit further, I would love for you to take a bit of a biographical step backward and talk about how you ended up doing the kind of work you're doing. and your own professional trajectory, because I do think it bears on this notion of the second E of engagement or of purpose that Damon speaks of.
Thank you. I'm going to try to keep this short. I'm the son of immigrants who came from Germany just in time, German Jews. They did not have a chance to have higher education, but education was important to them and became important to me. But as far as they was concerned, the only professional choices were to be a doctor or a lawyer. And since I didn't particularly like the sight of blood, that narrowed my options. But I fell in love with scholarship and was lucky enough to be trained in psychology and other social sciences. And until my work in intelligences became well known some decades ago, I just thought that I would continue to do research and writing. And of course, I have continued to do that. But it was the misuse of the ideas which I developed, which made me think, I have a responsibility not just to produce, so to speak, to do what I can to help those who are interested in work use it in a productive way and in a way that we can feel proud of rather than embarrassed. And so from the empirical research we did interviewing these 1,500 people and coming up with the triple helix, we call it, of excellence, engagement, and ethics, because some people are excellent, but they're not engaged. Some people are engaged, but are not ethical, and so on. That combination has really driven me and my colleagues over the last 10 or 15 years. And so we began to work with students, in part because a lot of students told us, and I will imagine this will make you and others squirm, they knew what it meant to be ethical, and someday they would be ethical, but they couldn't afford to be ethical now because their friends and colleagues weren't, and they're going to be damned if they were going to lose to them. So ethics was for later. And so we began to work with students in colleges, first in the local area in New England, but then in the big study that you alluded to with Wendy Fishman, we worked all across the country. And we're really trying to figure out, I've never used this analogy, sort of the pressure points which are most likely to help people be aware that there are ethical issues, and then to think about them in the best ways that they can. Let me give just one example, because this can become abstract very quickly. We give people what we call a value sort, and there they have 30 values, and they have to rank them in terms of importance, and there are things like being famous, being successful, being honest, being helpful. Honesty almost always is at the top of the list because we're all pretty good at being hypocritical about that issue. Then on another day, we'll ask people to make a clock of how they spend the week, what percentage of the time they spend on sleeping, what percent of the time they spend on online, what percentage of the time they spend talking to their friends, homework, and so on. And then we ask them to put their values next to the way they spend their time. And it's a shock because very few of us devote any significant amount of time to what we think are our most important values, and we flit a lot of time away. Anybody who's a teacher, as you and I know, that when students say they don't have time for their work and you ask them, well, how much time did you spend on Facebook and Twitter yesterday? There's a bit of a squirm because there's time for that. And there may not be time for reading or for writing papers. So that's a kind of a practical aspect of our toolkit. And what we're doing now, my group, with support from the Kern Foundation, is helping students to document the dilemmas they come up with each week and how they think about them. And we have kind of soft interventions to nudge them to think about these things better and perhaps to know how to attack them. When we talk about the D's involved with dilemmas, which is defining a dilemma, discussing it, debating it, deciding what to do, and then probably the most important thing, debriefing. Because you can't know that you've solved a dilemma correctly, but afterwards you can see whether it worked, and if not, you can discuss and debate. And I think these kinds of toolkits, one of the nicest things that came out of her study last year was a student said to me, I read the newspaper a lot more now than I did before. And this, Suzanne was saying, I have dilemmas, but the world is dealing with lots of dilemmas too. I mean, do we give away the vaccines for free? Do we prioritize countries that we like? Do we prioritize old people, or do we prioritize young people? And to be able to think about those, that's not just, am I treating my lover in the best possible way, or am I cleaning my room? But, where do I stand on this issue that's being debated around the world? And you might have to vote for candidates who take positions in these kinds of things.
So as you've discussed sort of your own background through the current, up to the current work of this project, it seems that in different places, there's an emphasis on the engagement piece, the excellence piece, or this sort of, the ethical piece, but also the different dimensions of what it is to be a good worker, a good citizen, or a good person. So in the last example that you gave, it's almost as if, and maybe I'm misreading this, but the students' engagement with what it is to be an ethical person in their daily life opened them up to how to behave ethically as a citizen, to have all of that much more so on their radar, knowing that they were going to participate in these more collective decisions. In your thinking, what is the relationship between good worker, good citizen, right, good person, and these three elements, if you will?
That's a great question, and we talked about it just beforehand. And I could write a book about it, but I want to try to give a 3 or 4 minute answer. To begin with, good person, good citizen, and good workers are not the same. The best way to think about it is that it used to be that when everybody was a farmer, everybody was a hunter. Those three things they were one. You didn't make a distinction. But now, a good person basically means a good neighbor, somebody who's a good family member, someone who follows the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule. And I have nothing new to say about that. That's something that's been worked out in many societies over the millennia. But citizen and workers, particularly professionals, those are new categories. I'm sure that in Rome and Greece, there were some people who were citizens, they were mailed to their own property, and there were some so-called professions like medicine, but I'm not sure I'd want to go to a Greek doctor about anything. But these are professions and institutions which have developed in the West and in other developed parts of the world over the last few centuries. And nobody picks up intuitively what it means to be a good citizen. You're a citizen of your community, of your region, of your state, of the world, and a profession, whether you're a doctor or a journalist or an educator. These are, again, things which are not in your DNA. These are things that you have to learn, and you learn them by being with people who are good at them. I hope good in both senses of the term, proficient, but also ethical, and in settings, whether it's schools or it's in vocational training or in apprenticeships or mentorships, where you see how people go about being workers and how they go about being a citizen. I'm going to strive not to be highly political today, but if you decide to be a journalist, it matters enormously if your first job is at NPR, PBS, or at Fox. As far as I'm concerned, NPR and PBS try very hard not to be too much into attitude, to distinguish rumor from truth, try not to foment a lot of problems. But Fox certainly does, and I don't think MSNBC or even CNN are much better. So the milieu in your first job is very, very important in getting a sense of what it means to be a good professional. So I said I wasn't going to filibuster in this, but please push me on aspects which I didn't touch on or where I could be clearer.
Yeah, so taking the notion of good worker, and so, right, excellence in terms of, right, having the requisite skills, having a sense of meaning and purpose in one's work, and then being ethical. Can you be a good worker with 2 of the 3? Is this really something that comes together? And are these things that that happen through education. And in particular, I'm thinking about the centerpiece around engagement and purpose, or is this something that comes from elsewhere, comes from the workplace itself? Are they integral together?
Okay, they certainly are not tightly intertwined. Let's take teaching, because that's something that everybody who's viewing would know something about. They can be teachers who know their work very, very well, could pass tests and be an expert in the profession. But as I've noticed that many of my colleagues, maybe myself as we get older, are much less engaged. Don't care that much about the students, don't care that much about the work. You can be also both very excellent and very engaged and be a crook. You can be doing all sorts of very illegal and very immoral things, but you're enjoying it. As Mike Csikszentmihalyi used to say, people who crack safes get a lot of flow, but they're robbing people for money. And so the educational challenge is, it's enormous. One of our empirical findings, which relates to your question, is almost everybody has what we call expanding rings of responsibility. When you're young, meaning responsible yourself and maybe your family, then when you go to school, you feel some sense of responsibility to school. Then you go to the workplace and you, of course, want to keep your job, but you might have some responsibility for the workplace. But as you get older, sometimes you get to feel a responsibility for the whole domain. What does law mean? What does education mean? Or even for the wider world, what does it mean in countries other than the ones that we know? And so when you have someone like Greta Thunberg, who's a kid and indeed may well be on the spectrum, who has a sense of responsibility for the world, that is highly, highly unusual. I happen to be a college classmate and friend of Bill Drayton, who started Ashoka, basically invented social entrepreneurship. Bill was on that from a very early age, but the rest of us, including me, we're not. So the capacity to master those three realms it's a long process. And I think part of our jobs as educators is to say to somebody, I'm glad you really like what you're doing. You seem to be engaged, but your writing is not clear. Or, if you're a young faculty member, your writing is good and you're very much engaged, but, the way you tweeted about your work is really unacceptable, and you insulted somebody, and that's not right. And, that may count against you, but it's also wrong. You shouldn't use social media to criticize someone. You should write them directly, or you should write a scholarly article and have it peer reviewed. And as you may know, I've written a memoir, and in the memoir, I spent a lot of time on my mentors, my tormentors, and my fragmentors. Mentors who did everything for me were wonderful teachers who cared about me and tried to help me become as good a person as I could. Tormentors are the people that say, God, the one person I don't want to be like is X. And fragmentors, I think, is a useful concept. Most of us aren't lucky to have a single mentor who can be a role model for the rest of our lives, and particularly because things change so quickly. I can't be a good role model for somebody who's 25 and living in the digital world the way I could have been half a century ago. But we can put together aspects of different people whom we know and admire. And for somebody, it might be the work ethics. For someone, it might be how they relate to other people. For someone, it might be how they write. And here's something, I haven't thought about this before, where those of us who have larger responsibility for students or for our own children, or in my case, my 5 grandchildren, can help them put together, you might say, a mosaic of individuals and influences who can be positive as well as ones that you want to stay away from. And we have our role models for being a good person in our family, living on the street with us. But until you begin to go to the workplace, you're not going to have a lot of role models for what it means to be a good worker, except perhaps in the family business. And for citizen, which is a huge topic now in a society which is trying to remain democratic, if you don't understand something about the nature of your government and how it works and how it should work, you can't possibly be a good citizen. My son was at a Thanksgiving party the other day with people whom he didn't know, and the person declared proudly, well, I'm not going to have a vaccine. Who needs it? And I would have said, well, I'm about to see my father, and I need it. A good citizen doesn't mean that you just do what you want yourself. You think about other people whom you might harm by what you don't do.
So how do we think about this in terms of education and education for undergraduates, for graduate and professional students, and then in the workplace? I had asked you before whether you thought it was possible for us to cultivate our sense of good citizenship and of good person through the pursuit of excellence in work, and you said you didn't think so. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Do we need separate kinds of engagements in schooling and in the workplace to address these?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. Let me step back a bit because I think I can provide some helpful context. In the study that Wendy Fishman and I have done about college, which you alluded to, we have found that most places have way too many missions. And as a result, we can prove to you with copious data, 10 years of data, that most people, including faculty, don't even know what the missions are, let alone how they're being achieved or not. And I don't have ill will against the people who create the mission statements, but they're just all over the map. So two things. One, if I were the czar, the mission would be non-vocational liberal arts education and a sense of ethics. What's the right thing to do? If I were the czar. But the way I would do it, and these are concepts which Wendy and I and our colleagues developed, is through onboarding and intertwining. Onboarding means from the day you apply, or certainly the day you're accepted at school, you are told what it is that is really valued and important in that school. When I applied to college, one college I was admitted to had told me about the honor code they had, and that made an enormous impact on me because they were saying, this is really important, congratulations, and this is how we make sure that people do honest work. So that's onboarding. But intertwining means in every course, and indeed in every extracurricular thing, the extent to which you can draw the mission in and show how it is really important. That's how you can actually bring about, we might say, a character or personality nudge in young people. And to get to the nub of your question then, if it is about doing work that's excellent, engaging, and ethical, this is something which becomes part of the warp and woof, whether you're studying chemistry or reading Plato, or you're in the string quartet. But our colleges have gone almost in the opposite direction. It's just trying to please everybody in every single way. And so people they get lost and they don't know why they're there, and they become extremely transactional. Well, this is what my parents want, this is what I want, and don't bother me with those courses, and don't bother me with those discussion groups. Just let me out of here. One of the things we haven't touched on yet at all is the importance of institutions, which are as important as professions. And I'm going to say this now, it comes from my friend Helen Murphy. American colleges and universities are among the very last institutions that are admired in the rest of the world. People still want to go to Harvard and Duke and Notre Dame, and you can add whatever you want. I think we're undermining ourselves by not taking the issues that I've discussed much more seriously and putting them front and center in our educational system. It'd be great if we didn't have to wait to college, and there are some good schools, parochial, public, where the 3 E's and the rings of responsibility and 5 D's of dilemmas are they're in the water, and that would be the answer to your question. You can do all 3 if they're in the water, but nobody comes to America to admire our secondary schools or our kindergartens. There are great ones, but the system as a whole is not very good. They do admire our colleges and universities, it'd be just tragic if in the effort to plan to please everybody, we end up not only pleasing nobody, but losing track of why people do admire our system.
That's great. So I like this notion of kind of onboarding and intertwining into all kinds of everyday activities in a university setting. How do you think about, right, when you look at the survey, you look at how people are thinking about it, is this what parents, educators, students want from college? Is it anybody asking for this? Or have we sort of moved into this hyper pursuit of professions?
Yeah, hyper pursuit of professions and of I. As I mentioned past, when you look at what the students say, the words I and me appear 9 or 10 times as often as we. When you ask students about ethics, most of them don't even know what it is. Yeah, no, I think you put your finger on why things are so problematic in this country. We have moved very much toward a it's all for me kind of society, and we're not caring about others. And the issue is, how is that going to be changed or reversed? And it certainly isn't going to just depend upon colleges, but as I've said, colleges are still respected. The very people who are in the legislature in Minnesota or Iowa bitching about the university will call up the president to complain that their child didn't get in. And I don't think I have to provide any more evidence. We know about this entirely. So here, I'm going to turn the question around to everybody to say, well, if we don't like what's happening in the society, and I think most people who are listening and viewing wouldn't be watching this unless they did, what are the institutions and what are the professions that are going to take the lead? And I would say colleges and universities are probably the best choice for institutions. And when it comes to professions, probably educators. Because I was sort of a typical professor in that I thought my work was just about teaching people psychology. But with the years, I realized that it wasn't just about that. It was about the kind of person you are and the way you treat others. And when you have problems, how do you help people? And even here, I think we can point our finger at the disciplines, because all the rewards are the people who have the most peer-reviewed articles in the best journals. And it's the job of student affairs to handle. You've been at Duke for many years. The one group that is expanding every year is student affairs. I think we faculty have to be the chief role models, not student affairs, excellent though it may be.
So 2 questions. One is about just this question and the extent to which disciplinary training makes it harder to do that kind of work with its own hyper specialization and expectations around research, publication, and the frequent refrain of faculty, which is I would have no idea how to think about the whole student. And then the second question is to talk a little bit about the role of character in your framework. So maybe start with the first one. How do we get faculty to feel comfortable doing the kind of work that you pivoted to yourself?
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. But I think both with regard to the school as a whole and regard to individual faculties in the sense of the psychology department, the law school, and so on, the role of leadership is very important. The worst thing for a leader is to say, do this, but don't do it yourself. But the leader doesn't do it himself or herself. I remember when we had a large problem with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and the dean had no success at all. And someone said, when Dean X, and I'll even say his name, he's still with us, Dean Rosofsky was around, he would have made 5 phone calls and people would have come around. When there are people who are highly respected in leadership positions, they have a lot of moral suasion. And I happen to know the presidents of a number of schools and deans of a number of schools, and they have non-trivial effects. And everybody watches not what they say, but what they do and how they handle it. I mean, every president of Harvard I know, when I send a note, I get an answer. And it's not done by AI, and it's not done by a subordinate. I can write to students who are sophomores, and I would wait for the rest of my life to get an answer. And so I think that role modeling is non-trivial, though it's not enough. The more difficult question you're asking is, if you don't know how to deal with somebody who, let's say, is showing a mental health problem, which are you can't pretend that you do, but you certainly need to know the facilities. You need to know if there's peer mentoring around. You need to know if there's a 6-week waiting list to get in to see a therapist, what other options are available, and inviting the person over for dinner, or sometimes, as Wendy has done, calling them up and saying how you're doing. These are things which anybody can do. You don't have to have a social work degree to do it. So yeah, I think everybody needs to ask more of themselves. And you may be saying, well, here's an old Harvard professor. It's easy for him to say. And I admit that I've had a charmed life in that sense, but we can't expect other people to do it. Everybody needs to be able to do what it is that they can. Character is not a word that I use professionally, though it's something that's incredibly important to me. When you ask me about my own life, my parents didn't teach me trigonometry or the calculus or about black holes, but they were amazingly ethical people. And it's up to other people to say whether I have any character, but there's nothing like having role models who say what's the right thing to do, goes through those discussions and dilemmas, debating, and then does it. And when it doesn't work out, learns more. And one thing which I think people who are viewing would know is things which were ethical dilemmas don't have to remain ones when you've gone through them a lot. I mean, the first time I was offered money to do research from somebody who told me what they wanted to have, this caused a dilemma. It doesn't cause the dilemma anymore. I say, thank you, you're not the person that I'd like to work with. And my students, my research groups, they pick that up. When I turned 70, colleagues put together writings about me. It's called a Festschrift. And I was struck and sort of surprised, but in the end, kind of pleased. More people talked about me as a role model for the way I did things than about particular theories I put forth. And if that's true, it's because of my parents and my family. They got it. And maybe living through Nazi Germany raised their consciousness, but I think they were decent people.
So let me just push you a little bit on that. So why don't you use the word character? Use the word ethics. Why doesn't character appear?
There's not a deep reason for that.
Okay.
I think one reason is when I think about character, I think about novels I've been reading and the characters there. But I've worked very closely with Bill Damon, whom I know you know, and Colby. And when they talk about the sense of purpose, that's very important to me. But we always talk about people who have the sense of purpose, but it's not a purpose that we necessarily would embrace. And that's where the question of the line between purpose, character, good work would require more lexical and scholarly analysis. But I'd fine for other people to use it. It's fine.
Okay. So no objection to it, just not something personally. Got it. Let's talk a little bit about the past year. Certainly, right, huge challenges for higher education, but also huge challenges for the nature of work, the nature of democracy, which seems rife for opportunities for your thinking of the good, whether it's good citizen or good work. How are you thinking differently? Or is this just, aha, I was right all along?
No. The older I get, the less sure I become about things like that. No, I think the one insight that I had, and it's not profound, but it's with me every day, is it makes us go back to the basics, both with terms of institutions and in terms of professions. let's say you're a journalist. Everybody knows something about journalism. Journalists, we need them, and they try to do good work. But what does it mean when you're dealing with highly complex medical and political issues on the one hand? You're dealing with rumors that are rife on the other. You're dealing with your own decision about what you can cover in person. And how do you maintain what's absolutely central to being a journalist under these radically changed conditions when you can't even travel? You can't go to interview people, we're stuck with Zoom and so on. And I think every profession and probably every job, including ones which are in the gig economy or service, just in time, things have had to think, how do I think about work under these conditions? And I think it's absolutely the same with with institutions. What does it mean to be a public school? What does it mean to be a school? What does it mean to be a business? What does it mean to be a service industry? What does it mean to be a professor when you can't get to see your students directly, when you don't know them, when you wouldn't recognize them, when you have a mask on? And I'm sure this is an idea that many people have had, maybe going back to ancient times, is these are wake-up calls. And in the original Good Work Project, we actually used the concept of a wake-up call, because sometimes it can be very positive. It can be something to say, my goodness, what I've been thinking about now is really useful and helpful. My research or my writing or my teaching is more relevant. But it can also be, hey, I've kind of lost track of what it really means to be a teacher, a professor. Professor isn't someone who should just profess. It is somebody who needs to be a role model to do what he or she can to help the students grow in a round way. So if there's anything good about the last year, it would be making us confront these issues and to go to the level of you, but everybody who's listening would understand, what does it mean to be a democracy? What does it mean to be a nation? What does it mean to have an agreement with a country when you don't follow it? It brings us back to basics. And many of us have lost much, including human beings. But if we can strengthen our society before we leave, as the Athenians say, leave the world a little bit better than it was, that's what character is, okay? It's leaving, it's making your best effort to leave the world a little bit better than it is. And some of us do it with our families, some of us do it with hobbies, some of us do it with our friends. Some of us are better to our enemies. I've heard several people in your program talk about how we should reach out to people whom we don't care for very much. But if you can impact the institutions in the workplace, and of course, all of us in good work think a lot about work in the gig economy, work in an artificial intelligence environment. Work is not going to be the same for the next century as it was for the last 10 or 15 years. And to end on what could be a good or bad note, the Good Work Project is not going to run out of things to worry about very soon. The world will help us with that.
Well, good. So as you were describing this current moment, I started thinking about the relationship between the kind of cultivation of individuals we do in a university setting versus in a workplace. And I'm recalling a conversation years ago with a colleague at Duke, Jim Coleman, in the law school, who said he was incredibly confident that when Duke law students graduated, they were incredibly ethical individuals and knew what the right thing to do was, and then ended up in workplaces, your example of Fox, but in the space of law, and were in a place where the norms were different, the values were different, and they started to behave in ways that they themselves and he might understand to be unethical. How do we sort of create continuity between professional education and professional spaces to create that kind of consistency of excellence, engagement, and ethics? Or is that not possible?
There's no book that's had a bigger impact on me and people who work with me than Albert Hirschman's book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Mm-hmm. When you go to a new organization, you give it the benefit of the doubt, even if it's Fox News or MSNBC. But if you don't like what's happening, you need to speak up. If you're in a democratic society, if you're in a totalitarian society, you go into math or music where nobody knows what's going on in your mind. And I mean that, unfortunately, seriously. But in a democratic society, you need to be able to say, I'm out of here. And a few times in my life, I've done that, and it's not easy. And sometimes people don't talk with you afterwards. But there's nothing that obligates somebody who goes to Duke Law School to stay forever, ever, for the rest of their life in a place where people are doing bad work. But the emoluments, is that the word, are very powerful. You know, you go to college or law school, you get summer internships in New York, you get a plush apartment, you get a car. And it's very hard to say I'm going to go be the public interest lawyer that I said I was going to be when I wrote my application to get in law school, because nobody says that I want to make $10 million a year in a white shoe law firm in New York. They don't say that. John Bliss, a colleague of us who's been working on the Good Work Project, has studied the way that students in law school draw the place of law in their world as opposed to family. And it's the ones for whom law is closest to their identity that are most likely not to fall prey to this kind of slippage that you talk about. But when they say, oh, that's just what I do to make money and something else is important, that's a danger sign. And that's a nice social science technique to have people make a visual representation of how they feel their work relates to the rest of their lives. And maybe, I know we're running out of time, having people talk a lot more with the concepts of the toolkit that we've mentioned. They don't have to use our terminology, they could use character or purpose or whatever, I think is a good thing, as long as people are honest with each other and actually say, well, you said this, but you're not really, I don't see you're doing this. Or, last week we were reading this case and you took this position, but doesn't seem to, and that's what we call the debate aspect of dilemmas. You have to be prepared to debate. And that means sometimes you have to be prepared to say something that your colleagues won't like or hear them say things that you wouldn't like. We're a society which, as you know, has become much more tunneled, and we talk mostly to people who are just like us. And that may make us feel better, but it means you're much less likely to be challenged. So, Suzanne, you and I, we can redesign the world, but I think we're going to need some help. And I'm hoping that the toolkit you and others, that we and other speakers come up with can be helpful.
So we have a question from the audience that picks up a little bit about this, and it talks about the relationship between the need for financial stability and ethical living at the level of individual and society, right? So, one of the fears of that young lawyer is, I need a job, and this seems to be the way things are done here, and everybody here seems to think it's ethical. So maybe it is. How would you personally, or your framework, encourage people to think differently about that binary?
Well, first of all, I think that voice is important. If you see something that isn't like what you expected, you ask about it. You don't assume that because people do it that way, it's always the right way to do it. And if you have friends to talk to, you don't only have people at the workplace to talk to. But here I'm going to reveal my own values. These jokes about the billionaire who's very angry because the multi-billionaire has 6 yachts, not just 5. And then one guy says to the other, well, I have something that neither of them has. And the answer is enough. And we know, and I've actually studied this and got a phone call from a 91-year-old lawyer who read the case study that we did 20 years ago, that law has changed entirely from a profession where it's basically a partnership and you make enough to have a decent living, to one where if you don't make millions of dollars, you feel you're a failure. This is, again, where role models become very important. It's important to have people like Brian Stevenson as lawyers, as role models, not just, I won't mention the names, the people who get the headlines because they get millions of dollars from defending people who don't deserve to be defended, except in the sense that everybody gets a defense person.
Great. So question from the audience is about the relationship between being a good person and a good worker and the ways these can be interrelated. It says, I find that many students find problems at the intersection of their personal and professional lives to raise the thorniest ethical questions. For instance, how should I balance obligations to family with my professional aspirations? Is it selfish to choose work I care about over work that I'd be great at and that could have a much bigger impact on the world? How do I fulfill my professional ambitions and potential without burning out? Is there anything you've encountered in your work that can help us, our students, think through these questions and the split between person and
it's a great question, and it allows me to mention what I'm working on nowadays. As I said earlier, you can be you can be an excellent worker and a louse as a person, or vice versa. But what I'm working now is on the human capacity called synthesizing. And what all of us have to try to do in our lives is to synthesize as much as possible strands which may be pulling us in different directions. And so, I mean, everybody, particularly if you get married and have a family and need to keep up your house and so on, is feel torn in that way. And you can go completely in one direction. You can go nuts. You can get therapy, which is often very helpful, or talk to your religious leader, which is cheaper than psychoanalysis. But it's a way of blending these different strands that in a way that they make sense. And one of the things which we have noted by people, I won't mention names, who are often the most remarkable in terms of the sacrifices they make, is they decide not to get married and to live, in a monastery. And that's a decision made for a reason, because you can't try to do everything. My wife and I have just been reading the great book, The Magician, by about Thomas Mann, and the great writer. And the book is really about being torn in many different directions and not how to deal with it. And people will differ if they've read the book, and whether Mann succeeded in doing it successfully. Certainly, if you've read the book, his kids didn't think he did. But we all wrestle with this, and my children and grandchildren will make a decision about whether OPA synthesized. I give my parents high grades, so if I get a low grade, it's not their fault.
Good. Another question. In the 1,600 interviews you conducted for the Good Project, was engineering one of the professions? And the responses came from, and were there any interesting differences between professions in the kinds of things you found and saw?
Okay. If we did the study today, we would definitely include engineering. And in fact, Wendy and I are beginning to look at engineering and computer science in local schools in the Boston area. There were very big differences. I'm going to summarize a book in a few sentences. Genetics in the year 2000 was very well aligned. Everybody was pleased with what they're doing. Everybody agreed about what they were doing. Nobody ever left the profession. Journalism was completely the opposite. It was already in disarray. A third of the people whom we interviewed, and these were people who were nominated for being good journalists, people like Tom Brokaw, everybody knows, wanted to leave the profession. Ironically, in terms of this program, many of them wanted to go teach in journalism schools, which is not the best way to atone if you think your profession is falling apart. Yeah, but the book, Good Work, When Excellence and Ethics Meet, published 20 years ago, describes the differences between the professions. But genetics and journalism was dramatic. But I thought recently the genetics would not be so well aligned now, because many people have said our best researchers are going into the private sector and they're not doing research anymore. So that's a synthesis as well. How do you do how do you intertwine what you've learned in a way that it's good for the society and not just for your own pocketbook? And I described the change in law and also in auditing, but I think it's also true in science now, especially in engineering, computing, and genetics. Probably not true in theoretical physics.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. Can we teach students to be ethical? If so, what does this look like? Maybe this is a turn to your work on dilemmas, perhaps? Is that?
Well, I think the best way to teach people by far is to have role models around who try to do the right thing. And when they don't do it, talk about it, reflect on it, and draw you into the conversation. I recently had a big personal thing where I let my ego get in the way of my sanity. And I discussed it with my grandchildren, and they had wonderful things to say. And our household isn't the Kennedy household, but talking about things when you're young with your children and your grandchildren, and keeping it up, I think that's a very good and very important way to nudge people in the right direction. But you need booster shots. And we talk about wake-up calls, I mentioned that earlier, but booster shots, everybody needs every once in a while to say, Howard, you were trying to do this in the right way, but I've noticed such and such. And it could be about your writing, but it could be about your writing, WRITING, but it could also be about your writing, RIGHTING. Are you doing the right thing?
Great. You've talked a lot about the place of role models. How do we find role models? Not everyone has Howard Gardner in their life who's willing to talk about writing in those two ways with one, or have Howard Gardner as a grandfather. How do you?
People are saying thank God, but there's a useful term in our field called paragon. Mm-hmm. And paragons are people who you don't know yourself, often they're dead. Lives of saints is, mm-hmm. But many of the most impressive people whom I've studied, because I've studied creativity and leadership, they look up to people who are no longer alive. It is kind of amusing to see everybody from Trump to Boris Johnson using Winston Churchill as their paragon. He's sort of available for sale. But Jeffrey Reescoff has just written a book saying that we need to know about the bad Churchill as well. And some paragons are not all good, but that's one. And literature. I mean, when I was a kid, I read the landmark books about every baseball player and every politician. And of course, those were skewed in a positive direction, but it has an impact on you. And I've never enjoyed watching criminal shows that much, because I don't think those are the role models. The gangs of Chicago of the 1920s. Those are role models which I think they're glamorized. And when we look at what we call real America and free America, terms you probably know from George Packer, they're much too much influenced by American Westerns, which not only have the solo cowboy, but have anybody who isn't the white male treated as if they were not human. And so, getting positive role models from literature, paragons, and from real life. When I say Gandhi is the most important person of the last 1,000 years, I mean it. And I'm not Gandhi in any sense, but I look up to what he did.
Great. And one final question. So for someone who has inspired so many, what inspires you and motivates you in your work now after this illustrious, decades-long career promoting good work?
Well, that's an easy one. Freud said Leben und Arbeiten, love and work. My family is incredibly important to me. My wife, who helped us set up, and she's just amazing, and she's a colleague as well. But I get up every morning and I take a walk and I think about things and I write about them. I blog. I probably have written 500 blogs in the last 5 years. I'm happy if people read them, but I do them because there's a way to think about it. And as I mentioned earlier, just in passing, I've become obsessed with the notion of what it means to synthesize. And I think it's an ability that's important, particularly in a time when AI and other kinds of algorithms can do so much routine work better than human beings. And so I'm now currently writing 5 blogs about synthesizing in history, and I've written about it in poetry and finance and politics. And it keeps me going. And even though you can't control whether you go senile, you can certainly keep your mind active with friends and with crossword puzzles and with the work. And I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. And if people who rub shoulders with me get some of that, that's the greatest pleasure of all.
Wonderful. So I just want to thank you so much for spending lunchtime with us and for hearing a bit more about your work and where it's going next. So hugest thanks. And just a quick reminder, Monday, December 13th, we will have a conversation on pluralism and the purpose of higher education. So thank you, Howard. This was just delightful.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to watch your series and to have been asked to participate.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.
Bye-bye.